Racist cop strikes black woman on her own street. Career ends in 3 minutes. The handcuffs never came, but the wall did. Diana Mercer was 4 blocks from her mother's house when Officer Derek Calloway stepped off the curb and placed himself in her path. She had her hands visible. She had done nothing. She had her license ready before he finished asking for it. None of that mattered. What happened next happened fast, and it happened in front of witnesses, and it happened to a woman who stood against a brick wall afterward, with her palm flat on the cold surface and her breathing even and her face beginning to change color at the bone. She did not cry out. She did not beg. She did not reach for what was in her coat pocket. Not yet. There was a black SUV parked half a block away with its lights off. It had been there the whole time. Calloway had not noticed it. He had no idea what he had just done. If stories like this stay with you, hit subscribe. And drop a comment if something about this moment feels heavier than it should. And now, the night that changed everything. The punch came before Diana Mercer had finished her sentence. Not a full swing. The heel of a hand, driven forward with the careless authority of someone who has done something like this before and learned that the doing of it requires no particular precision. The sound was small, dense. Nothing like the sounds violence makes on television, which are theatrical and enormous. This was the sound of something ending without ceremony. She did not fall. Her shoulder found the brick wall of the building behind her, and she used it, pressed her left palm flat against the cold surface, found her footing, and held. The left side of her face had begun to change at the bone, not with pain yet, but with the early intelligence of what the pain would become. She looked at Officer Derek Calloway, with her hand still against the brick and her breathing even. She said nothing. That was the part that Harriet, sitting on the stoop 3 doors down with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, would not be able to stop thinking about in the days and weeks that followed. Not the punch, the stillness after it, the woman who had been struck by an officer of the law and had straightened herself against a wall and looked at him with the equanimity of someone who has been preparing for exactly this moment for a very long time and knows, with the certainty of deep experience, what comes after it. Diana Mercer was 52 years old. She had grown up 4 blocks from here, on this same street, in the narrow row house where her mother still lived. She had left at 17 for a scholarship at Penn and had come back every weekend for the first 2 years, less often after that. But always, always on her mother's birthday, and always on the first Sunday in December, when her mother made the sweet potato pie that Diana had eaten at that kitchen table since she was old enough to sit at it. She knew every crack in every sidewalk on this block. She knew which window would be lit at 7:15 on a January evening and which would be dark, and which was always dark, because the couple who lived behind it worked the night shift at the hospital on Route 9. She had known, when she turned the corner at Crane Street 6 minutes ago, that tonight was going to require something from her that most evenings did not. She carried nothing in her hands. It was a practice she had maintained on Millard Street since she was 16, both palms visible, pace steady, no sudden movements, nothing to point to. The credential wallet in her left coat pocket sat flat against her ribs, navy blue, worn soft at the corners from 11 years of being handled every day. She had not reached for it. She would not reach for it unless no other option remained. Half a block east, at the far edge of the street lamp's reach, a black SUV sat with its engine off and its lights completely dark. It had been there when she stepped off the 7:04 bus at the corner of Millard and Crane. A woman walking a terrier had passed it on the sidewalk without a glance. The man from the 2nd floor who came down every evening to check his mail had walked directly past it, keys in hand, not noticing it at all. Diana had noticed it the moment she turned the corner. She had understood immediately, and with a clarity that did not require analysis, that it was precisely where it was supposed to be. Officer Derek Calloway stepped off the curb at 7:14 p.m. He was 38 years old, 11 years on the Marlow Heights Police Department, badge number 4471, 9 formal complaints in his personnel file, stops without cause, excessive force, language that witnesses described consistently as degrading, and 9 outcomes that ranged from letters of counseling to a 3-day administrative suspension he had served playing cards at his brother-in-law's house in Maryland. The departmental commendation from 2019 hung framed in the precinct break room. The complaints were archived in a folder that had not been opened since the last one was processed. Calloway had learned something over 11 years about the capacity of a system to accommodate itself around what a person chooses to do. He had learned it the way a river learns a riverbed, by moving through it without resistance, finding the channel, and discovering that the channel deepens slightly with each passage. His partner tonight was Officer Petra Sims, 31, 6 years on the force, standing 2 steps behind him and to his left with her thumbs in her belt, and her expression configured into what passed in certain precincts for professional neutrality. Sims had developed, in 6 years, the specific talent of being present in a way that provided structural support without generating its own documentation. It was a useful talent. She had refined it carefully. "Hold on," Calloway said. He did not say, "Excuse me." He did not say, "Ma'am." He said, "Hold on," the way a man says it when the assumption of compliance is already built into the phrasing itself, when the word is less a request than an announcement. Diana stopped. She looked at him without expression. "Where are you headed?" "To visit my mother," she said. "She lives on the next block." He studied her. The charcoal wool coat, the composed posture, the absence of the quality he had spent 11 years learning to identify as deference. The absence of it was not in itself a crime. He had learned, however, to find proximate reasons in the vicinity of things that were not crimes, and the skill was well developed by now, worn smooth with use. "I need to see some ID," he said. The street lamp above flickered once and steadied. Inside the black SUV, nothing moved. Diana held Calloway's gaze for a moment before she responded. Not a long moment, just long enough to let the space between his request and her compliance carry the weight it deserved. "Can you tell me why you're stopping me?" she asked. "You match a description." "What description?" He did not answer that. "Ma'am, ID." She reached into her coat pocket with deliberate slowness. The slowness of someone who understands that every movement is being read and annotated in real time, and produced her driver's license. She held it out. He took it without making eye contact and examined it with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who understands that duration is a form of pressure, that making someone wait is one of the few kinds of force that leaves no mark. Behind him, Officer Sims had produced a small notebook, black cover, spiral-bound, and opened it to a blank page. She began to write something. Diana could not see what. Whatever Sims was writing, it had not been prompted by anything Diana had done. It was preemptive record-keeping of a particular kind, the kind that fills available space before the facts have finished arriving. Calloway turned the license over. Turned it back. Diana Mercer, Washington, D.C. Address, 52 years old. "Long way from home," he said. "I grew up on this street," Diana said. "My mother still lives here." He returned the license without looking at her. He did not step aside. He had not moved from the position he'd taken when he stepped off the curb, and the position communicated something that no single sentence could communicate. That this moment would end when he decided it would end. Diana replaced the license in her coat pocket. Her fingers, in passing, grazed the edge of the credential wallet, the worn seam of it, the hard corner of the badge inside. She felt the old calculus activate, the variables she had been running since she was 25 years old, and first carried a federal badge on streets that looked like this one. The cost of revealing, the cost of not revealing. The way the equation changed depending on how much time had passed and how much ground had already been given up. She withdrew her hand. The wallet stayed where it was. Sims turned a page, wrote another line. The second phase of Calloway's approach began without announcement and without any change in his expression. He simply moved, a half step closer, closing the distance between them in a way that was not aggressive enough to be described as aggressive, not close enough to be described as threatening, but close enough to communicate both things without the documentation. "I'm going to need you to empty that pocket," he said. Diana looked at him. The cold air between them had grown still in the way that air grows still when a situation has narrowed to a single point of pressure, and everything else, the street, the lamplight, the sound of a television through someone's open window half a block away, has pulled back from that point the way water pulls back before a wave. "You've seen my identification," she said. "That's what you asked for. I provided it. I'm asking for the rest." "There is no lawful basis for that request," Diana said. "I know my rights under the Fourth Amendment, and I am going to exercise them." Something moved across Calloway's face. Not anger. Something older than anger. Something that had been living in him longer than any specific grievance had. The look of a man who has been told no in a register he is not accustomed to hearing no in, and whose entire professional training has equipped him with a range of responses to that register, none of which involve accepting it. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "I'm answering your questions," Diana said. "That's all I'm doing." He reached for his radio, called in a request for backup, not because he needed it, but because the presence of backup changed the arithmetic of the situation in ways that were difficult to articulate and easy to feel. Diana heard him recite her description. Charcoal coat, middle-aged black female. She heard, in the careful neutrality of his radio voice, the shape of the story he was beginning to construct around her. Sims was still writing. 3 doors down, Harriet had put her tea on the railing and was watching without pretending not to watch. She had called her son at 7:21 p.m. and said, in 4 words, "Something's happening outside," and then stayed on the line so he could listen. The backup vehicle arrived at 7:29 p.m. Officer Kevin Brandt, 26 years old, 2 years on the force, parking his cruiser half a block away and walking toward the scene with the brisk, uncomplicated energy of someone who has not yet learned to question the framing of the situation he's arriving into. He looked at Diana. He looked at Calloway. He took up a position on the other side of her, completing the geometry of the stop. 1 officer in front, 1 on the radio, 1 at the flank, so that the space available to Diana shrank to the approximate dimensions of a decision. "Officer Calloway," Diana said. Her voice remained level. "I want to be clear about something. Whatever you write in that report tonight, the events on this sidewalk are being observed. They have been observed since before you stepped off the curb." Calloway's eyes moved briefly to the dark SUV half a block away. Looked at it for less than a second. Filed it as a parked car. "That's fine," he said. "Step over here." "Tell me why," Diana said. "Because I am instructing you to." "That is not a legal reason." He moved. Not toward the vehicle, toward her. And what followed in the next 4 seconds was a compression of momentum and miscalculation. A sequence of events that 3 separate witnesses would later describe in careful and independently consistent detail. His hand going for her arm, her right hand moving instinctively toward her coat pocket, his interpretation of that movement, and then the punch that arrived before anything else could happen. She pressed her palm against the brick. She found her footing. She straightened. The SUV doors opened. In the months that followed, investigators would obtain that notebook as evidence, and the entries Sims had made during this stop would be examined against the actual sequence of events as documented by 3 other sources. The discrepancies would be significant. They would be, in their way, among the most consequential entries in the 48-item case file that Diana Mercer's office would build around Precinct 7's conduct record. Not because they were the most dramatic, but because they were the most precisely and meticulously wrong. On the stoop, Harriet set down her cup of tea. The second phase of the stop began without announcement. Calloway moved a step closer. "What else is in that pocket?" "My personal property," Diana said. "I'm going to need you to produce everything that's in there." She looked at him. On what legal basis? The muscles along his jaw tightened. She had seen that tightening many times. In interrogation rooms across the country, in depositions, in the faces of men who had already made their decision and were now, in real time, discovering the reason they would give for having made it. It was a look she had learned to read accurately and what it told her now was the same thing it had told her every previous time she had seen it. Something was coming, and the space available for preventing it was nearly gone. "Step over to the vehicle," Calloway said. "I haven't done anything," she said. "Ma'am, step over to the vehicle." "No, tell me the basis for this stop." Behind Calloway, Sims said something that was not technically a word that could be transcribed in a formal complaint, not because it was unclear, but because it occupied the register below deniability, the linguistic space that has been used on streets like Millard Street for a long time and is calibrated precisely to be heard without being heard in the official sense. Diana absorbed it the way she had absorbed such things since adolescence. Not with the shudder of someone encountering it for the first time, but with the flat, exhausted recognition of someone who knows exactly what it is and what it is designed to do, and has long since stopped being surprised by it. She did not react to it. She did not look at Sims. She kept her eyes on Calloway. His hand moved toward her arm. She made a decision, in the 2 seconds before contact, about how this encounter would proceed. A decision rooted in 30 years of professional judgment and 35 years of lived experience on streets like this one. She would not give him anything that could be written as a second item in Sims's notebook. She would not provide resistance. She would maintain her position and her composure and wait for the thing that was coming. What came was not what she had measured for. His grip closed on her arm. Her right hand, without conscious instruction, the body's own calculus running faster than deliberate thought, moved toward her coat pocket. Calloway saw the movement. He reacted to the movement before it had finished becoming a movement. The punch came before Diana Mercer had finished her sentence. She pressed her palm against the brick. She found her footing. She straightened. The credential wallet was in her pocket. She had not reached it. Her face was beginning to hurt in the way that a bruise announces itself, not with the sharpness of impact, but with the deep, spreading intelligence of tissue that has been forcibly introduced to bone. She looked at Calloway, and half a block away, both doors of the black SUV opened simultaneously with the quiet efficiency of things that have been planned. Calloway was still breathing hard, not from exertion, but from something else that requires oxygen, when the footsteps reached him. 3 sets, moving steadily, without running, with the measured pace of people trained to close distance in a way that forecloses options without appearing to rush. He felt them before he heard them clearly, the way you feel a change in barometric pressure before you understand what kind of weather it signals. He turned. 3 people in dark suits stood 4 feet away. The taller of the 2 men wore an earpiece. The woman to his left held a radio, not raised, simply present. Their faces were composed in the particular way of people who have been in situations like this before, and have learned that composure is not just a professional quality, but a tactical one. "This is an active police matter," Calloway said. His voice had changed since the punch. Something in it had gone slightly wrong. "Step back, officer," said the tall man. "I am in the middle of a lawful." "Step back." Sims closed her notebook. Her thumbs came out of her belt. She looked at the tall agent with the expression of someone doing rapid arithmetic and arriving at an answer they do not want. Diana Mercer reached into her left coat pocket and produced the credential wallet. She held it open with the unhurried authority of someone who has done this before, who has learned that the moment of opening requires nothing more than the opening itself. No announcement, no explanation, no escalation. The badge was gold. Above it, the text, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Below it, smaller, but entirely legible in the light of the street lamp, Director. The street was very quiet. Harriet, on the stoop, was not breathing. The tall agent did not look at the badge. He kept his eyes on Calloway. Director Mercer. "Are you injured?" "I'm fine, Agent Okafor," Diana said. She closed the wallet. "Notify the duty officer at DOJ. Contact Internal Affairs at Marlow Heights tonight, not in the morning." Calloway opened his mouth. "Don't," Diana said. One word. The specific weight of a word that has been earned over a long career through situations that required the person saying it to understand exactly how much it would cost the other person not to listen. He did not speak. Petra Sims had taken 3 steps backward without appearing to decide to do so. She was looking at the notebook in her hand the way a person looks at an object they have momentarily forgotten owning. Then she was looking at Agent Okafor, who had turned to face her with his hand extended, palm up, waiting. She held the notebook for 4 seconds. Then she placed it in his hand. Okafor did not look at it. He passed it to the agent on his left, who logged it into evidence without being instructed to do so. The third vehicle arrived on Millard Street 19 minutes after the SUV doors had opened. A DOJ duty attorney came in that vehicle, along with a woman from the city's office of the Inspector General, carrying a camera, a clipboard, and the particular expression of someone who has been called to this kind of scene before and intends to document it comprehensively. She began with the wall. The brick surface where Diana's shoulder and hand had made contact, the exact height of the impact point, the ambient light conditions. She moved to the street lamp, the distance from the lamp to the contact point, the angle of the parked vehicles, the position of the notebook relative to Sims at the time she produced it. She worked without commentary in the way that careful documentation is done, systematically, chronologically, without editorializing. The paramedic arrived at 8:48 p.m. While the paramedic worked, Agent Okafor stood at Calloway's left shoulder and made 3 phone calls in sequence, each one brief, each one initiated before the previous one had fully concluded. The first was to the FBI duty officer. The second was to the United States Attorney's Office for the district. The third was to a number whose recipient Diana did not ask about because she already knew. When Okafor finished the third call, he looked at her once across the 8 feet between them and gave the smallest nod, and she understood that the things that needed to be set in motion had been set in motion. Officer Kevin Brandt, the backup officer who had arrived at 7:29 p.m. and positioned himself at Diana's flank, stood on the sidewalk outside the scene perimeter looking at nothing with great concentration. He was 26 years old and had been on the job for 2 years. And what he was experiencing, the understanding that he had arrived into a situation whose actual geometry was nearly the inverse of the geometry he had been handed, was a kind of education that 2 years on the force had not prepared him for and would take considerably longer to fully absorb. He would file his own statement the following morning. It would be 8 pages. He would use the words unclear at the time 4 times and inconsistent with my training twice. The language would be the language of a person who is beginning to understand something and does not yet have the full vocabulary for it. The statement would be included in the Precinct 7 case file as Item 51. He examined Diana's cheekbone under a handheld light. The bruise had developed fully now, darkening at the center and fading at the margins in the characteristic pattern of impact trauma. A contusion approximately 4 centimeters at its widest point, consistent with blunt force contact from a hand. No crepitus, no fracture line palpable on external examination. He asked twice if she would accept transport to a medical facility. Both times Diana said no. Harriet came down from her stoop at 8:53. She gave her statement in 4 minutes and 20 seconds of uninterrupted, precise narration and declined to leave, until she was certain the attorney had written down the date in September, when she had watched a similar stop on the same block result in a man being put against the same wall. She said his name. The attorney wrote it down. The woman from the 3rd floor, whose text messages, sent during the incident, had already been received by 2 separate recipients, came down at 9 o'clock. She described what she had seen with the specificity of someone who has watched this kind of thing from this particular window before. She named 2 other dates. She said she had filed complaints both times. She said she had received 1 form letter. The attorney wrote all of it down. At 9:12 p.m., Officer Derek Calloway was transported to the district office on Crane Street by 2 officers from a different precinct who said nothing to him during the 12-minute drive. At 9:23, his badge and service weapon were surrendered at the watch commander's desk. At 9:47, the suspension paperwork was complete. Officer Petra Sims was placed on administrative leave at 10:03 p.m. She accepted the notification standing in the parking lot outside the precinct without speaking. She looked, in that moment, like someone who had been calculating distance and found it insufficient. The notebook was entered into evidence at 10:11 p.m. Diana arrived at her mother's house at 8:52 p.m., 40 minutes later than she had planned. Lorraine Mercer was 78 years old and had been watching from the kitchen window since she first heard voices on the street. She did not say anything when Diana came through the door. She went to the kitchen and filled the kettle and turned on the burner and took down the mug with the chipped handle. The one Diana had brought from a conference in Boston in 2002 and given to her because her mother had admired the color of it, and which Lorraine had used every day since because it was the mug Diana had brought her, and that was reason enough, and set it on the table. She sat down across from her daughter. The bruise on Diana's face was visible in the kitchen light. Fully formed now, dark at the center. Lorraine looked at it for a long time. "I know, Mom," Diana said. Lorraine reached across the table and placed her hand over Diana's. Neither of them spoke. Outside, on Millard Street, the block had gone quiet again. The particular quiet that follows a thing that will be talked about for a long time. "Are you going back tonight?" Lorraine asked. "I have a briefing," Diana said. "Of course you do." The kettle sounded. Lorraine poured the tea and returned to her chair and looked at her daughter across the table with an expression that had taken 78 years to develop. Not pity, not fear, but a layered and exhausted recognition. The recognition of a woman who had raised her daughter to walk through the world with her hands visible and understood, in full, what that cost, and knew that the cost was ongoing. Diana drank the tea. She had 9 minutes before the DOJ car arrived. She used all 9. When she stood to leave, her mother came with her to the door. Lorraine looked at her first, the way she had always looked before sending Diana back out into the world, taking full inventory before releasing her to it. Then she held her, briefly, with the grip of someone who is letting go of something that belongs to the world, and not only to them. "Be careful," Lorraine said. "I always am," Diana said. The car drove north through the city toward FBI headquarters. The case file for Precinct 7 had been under construction for 11 months. 47 incidents, 47 names, 47 encounters that had been documented and submitted and processed and returned with form letter outcomes or no outcomes at all. Stops without cause. Property damaged. Language used in registers below deniability. People who had filed complaints and received nothing, and had, eventually, stopped filing. Not because the incidents had stopped, but because the math of filing and receiving nothing had, over time, resolved into an answer. Tonight's incident was the 48th entry. It carried something the first 47 had not. Documentation initiated by 3 federal agents, supplemented by a city inspector's field report, 2 civilian witness statements taken formally on the scene, 1 body cam recording that Sims had failed to disable, and Special Agent Marcus Webb's field report filed at 8:23 p.m. 12 words precisely. Unprovoked use of force against protected federal official. Full documentation attached. Diana read the file from the beginning when she arrived at her desk at 11 p.m. Not because she needed to. She had read it many times. She had built it, or helped build it, over 11 months of work that had never been for any purpose other than the one it was now approaching. She read it because there were 47 names in the secondary register before tonight's edition, and those names belonged to people who had walked through something on a street like Millard Street, on a night like tonight, and had done the paperwork and waited for something to come of it and received nothing, and the least she could give them, the smallest acknowledgement of what that waiting had cost, was her attention. She read every name. She read the name of the 70-year-old man who had been stopped on his front steps in 2020 and asked to prove he lived there. She read the name of the woman whose car had been searched without consent in 2021 and who had arrived at work 45 minutes late that day because of the duration of the stop and had been written up. She read the name of the 16-year-old who had filed in 2022, whose mother had filed on his behalf, and who had received a form letter at an address that turned out to have been entered incorrectly into the system. So the letter had been returned undeliverable, and the file had been marked resolved. She read the names of people who had filed twice and once, and not at all, because filing had already proved, in their experience, to be a form of work that produced no result except the documentation of having done the work. She thought about all of them, in the specific way she had learned to think about such things, not with the kind of emotion that would impair the work, but with the kind of attention that would make the work mean something. At 4:14 a.m., she flagged the case summary for DOJ Civil Rights and added a one-paragraph addendum. The January 11th incident on Millard Street had occurred within 300 yards of incident reports filed in 2019, 2020, 2021, and twice in 2023. The addendum did not characterize. It placed events in sequence and let the sequence speak. At 4:17, she copied the subcommittee chair. At 4:18, she closed the file. The credential wallet sat on the corner of her desk where she always placed it when she sat down to work. Flat, navy blue, worn soft at the corners, carrying inside it the same badge it had always carried. She did not look at it. In a few hours, it would be in her pocket again, the same as it was every morning, the same as it had been for 11 years. She stood. She smoothed her coat. She walked toward the elevator. On Millard Street, the block was quiet. Harriet's light was off. The window on the third floor was dark. The street lamp threw its yellow light onto the sidewalk the same way it had thrown that light for years before tonight, and would throw it for years after. In the morning, Harriet would tell her granddaughter about what she had seen. She would describe the punch and the wall and the stillness afterward. The woman who did not fall, who put her palm flat against the brick and found her footing and looked at the officer, who had hit her with the composure of someone who had been planning the rest of that evening for a very long time. She would describe the badge catching the light of the street lamp, the one instruction given quietly, without raising her voice, to the tall agent who moved before the sentence was finished, the documentation that followed, the careful and systematic accounting. The granddaughter would wait for what came after all of that, Harriet would think. She walked to her mother's house, Harriet would say. The granddaughter would wait again, expecting something more. That was all, Harriet would say. She walked to her mother's house. 4 blocks. Her hands in her pockets. The same as she would have walked it if none of the rest of it had happened. As if that were not in itself the whole point. It was.
What you just watched is fiction, but the world that made it feel real is not. The question at the center of this story is one that millions of Americans have carried for generations. What does it mean to walk down a street in your own neighborhood, in the city where you were born, and be stopped? Not because of what you did, but because of what you look like. The data is not a matter of interpretation. The Stanford Open Policing Project analyzed more than 100 million traffic stops across the United States and found that black drivers are stopped at significantly higher rates than white drivers. A 2020 study published in Nature found that black individuals are 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white individuals, even after controlling for differences in encounter rates. The Department of Justice's own investigations into municipal police departments. Ferguson in 2015. Louisville in 2023 have documented in precise and exhaustive detail patterns of racially discriminatory policing that were not aberrations. They were systems. This is not new. The practice of stopping black Americans on streets and sidewalks for the crime of existing without deference has its roots in the slaved patrol systems of the antebellum South, codified later into black codes and then into the informal but pervasive enforcement culture of Jim Crow. During Reconstruction, vagrancy laws were deployed to recriminalize black freedom of movement. In the 20th century, the Supreme Court's 1968 ruling in Terry v. Ohio gave officers legal cover for stop-and-frisk encounters based on what the court called reasonable suspicion, a standard that, in practice, has never been applied evenly across race. In 2013, a federal judge ruled that the New York Police Department's stop-and-frisk program constituted a pattern and practice of unconstitutional stops, with 88% of those stopped between 2004 and 2012 being Black or Latino, and 88% of those being entirely innocent. Sandra Bland stopped her car in 2015 for a minor traffic violation in Prairie View, Texas. 3 days later, she was dead in a jail cell. Philando Castile, who had been stopped by police 46 times in 13 years, announced calmly that he was a licensed gun owner before being shot in front of his partner and her 4-year-old daughter. Breonna Taylor was in her own home. The list extends backward in time and forward to today, and what runs through it is not randomness. It is pattern. The badge in Diana Mercer's pocket changed what happened next on Millard Street. For 47 other people in the case file built around Precinct 7, there was no badge. There was only the paperwork, and the waiting, and the silence that eventually replaced the waiting. That silence is not the end of the story. It never was.